Well, it's I don't know that it's a matter of one feeling inferior to anyone. I think, I as an African American man, I share a similar belief. I don't feel that I'm inferior to anyone, but at the same time, as I navigate, through my life and through society, I constantly run up against systems where it's blatantly apparent that these systems weren't designed with me in mind. Okay, whereas my white counterpart, if you will, can walk into these spaces and through these corridors and insert themselves in places and be embraced and have things readily accessible to them. Whereas I, on the other hand, I gotta climb a wall, I gotta go up under this ditch, I gotta duck around, I gotta go through hoops. Okay, and so, to your point, for me, it's I'll just read an excerpt out of this is out of Education Weekly. This article just came out here this year, and it talked about the conservative perspective. It says one conservative organization, the Heritage Foundation, recently attributed a whole host of issues to CRT, including the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, LGBTQ clubs and schools, diversity training in federal agencies, organizations. California recently California's recent ethnic studies model curriculum, the free speech data debate on college campuses and alternatives to exclusionary discipline, such as the Promise Program in Broward County, Florida, uh, that some parents blame for the Parkland school shooting. Okay, it talked about um, how when followed to the logic of conclusion, CRT is destructive and rejects the fundamental ideas on which our constitutional republic is based on, the organization claimed. Okay, so again, to my point, that Constitution also once referred to me as three-fifths of a man. Okay, so tell me where in that Constitution or any space in this country where I go where I'm not going to, where I have a privilege, or I'm not going to have to, go over or overcome some type of obstacles and hurdles just to be heard, seen, and even respected to some degree.
Uh, Welcome, Dr. McCain and Dr. Schneider. I know you gentlemen are on very limited time, so I'll try not to keep you too long. But
Excellent.
No, we really appreciate the invitation. Absolutely, this is an important conversation. It means a lot that we get to be part of it. So thank you.
uh, what we were getting a little bit into CRT, and my thought is if you are psychologically affected by CRT, then you have another problem. I mean, that it's not the problem that you have with your race or my race. Somewhere you have a self-esteem problem, because this, to me, this is truth. This is not something that's made up. So if you're teaching true history, how can you do it without including CRT?
Yeah.
You want to take the first one? So I think first off, I really appreciate you having us on. James, Derek, it's nice to meet you. Michael, it's nice to meet you. I think, James, what you're saying is absolutely correct. So I don't know how far in the weeds of CRT you all have gotten already, but we got plenty of time to unpack that. But if we just take a really easy example, right, and Derek bringing up the Heritage Foundation saying that somehow CRT gets us to the Parkland shooting and all that other nonsense is a good example of, if anyone wants to seriously say that the teaching of race is not an important part of teaching American history, you have a serious intellectual or academic deficit, or you're very afraid of something and you need to go work that out. I think the question that is a little more interesting is CRT, whatever that actually is, and we can get in the weeds of like what that intellectual product actually is, where it came from, why it's that term, what it means. That's a whole other conversation. But I think you're not an honest teacher or politician or citizen if you're not acknowledging, like Derek pointed out, the role of systemic racism in American society and the fact that there are historical documents and parts of American history that do have a racist legacy. And so we just really quickly, earlier tonight, we were looking at the letter that we have. I think 19 attorney generals sent a letter to the Department of Education saying you can't give any federal funding to anyone if they're teaching critical race theory, all these other things. And then they actually say in parentheses, it would therefore be not allowed to teach that the American Constitution was not only created with the principle of all men created equal. Well, these two white guys are not about to like explain to you all, as Derek just said, why the 13th Amendment proves that the original documents did not have everybody equal. The 3/5 clause proved that not everyone was equal. I mean, this isn't rocket science. So what concerns me is that people getting freaked out about CRT has already created a situation where attorney generals are saying you couldn't teach constitutional law. Like what, our law schools suddenly can't talk about the 13th Amendment? Like that's bananas. So I think, to your point, James, we got to figure out what's scaring these people so bad so we can have an honest conversation about how to fix education to make sure that the racial lens of American history, law, etc., is taught in a responsive and responsible way. But you can't just ignore that facet of education and that facet of history. That's craziness.
Dr. Snyder, you want to comment on that before we go to Michael?
I don't really have anything to add. I do want to hear what Michael has to say.
Michael,
Yeah.
everyone's putting you on the spot here.
I love the spot. Put me on the spot. No. So I think that the answer is that a couple things. One, I think that it's not academia that's interpreting CRT. I think it's popular culture and people who don't know what it is, and then they're taking that view and they're allowing their fears to project what it's going to be and what it's going to mean to us. I think in general, particularly in the contemporary sort of tension between racial groups that's been absolutely fueled by the political rhetoric of the last 4.5 years. I think people are less likely to see somebody who looks different as an ally, and so for me, I've spent a lot of time on conservative Instagram because it fascinates me. And I would say the prevalent perspective is I am not a racist. I've never been a racist. Maybe 10 decades ago, there was a racism connected to me in somehow, but there's no way in hell it's fair for you to tell me, and this goes to reparations, right? But what they don't understand is that critical race theory is simply that. It's a critical theory. It's a theory that looks at the societal structure and proposes ways in which it's been deficient or has not lived up to expectations. And so no one likes to be criticized. People don't understand what the theory is, and we're in the middle of a situation where everyone wants to fight everybody else who doesn't look like them.
I think Mike might have given a simpler answer, so I'm going to take pointers from him on how to do that. But yeah, I think I would agree with that as well.
So let's get to the second part of this. Culturally reformed, culturally responsible teaching. This is a term that really kind of throws me for a loop because every culture has a sort of built-in prejudice. So if you're teaching about only your culture, are you not leaving out a whole lot of history as well as information that we should have in order to go forward?
100%.
I think you are, but I also think here's the term culture is very broad. Okay. because not only does it include race, but it includes your ideas, your principles, your values, and things that you ascribe to. So it's very broad in that way. So, for example, when you talk about culturally relevant pedagogy, let's name a place that all kids have been to that's culturally relevant for all kids. We've all been there. All four of us have been there. Probably went there today. McDonald's.
McDonald's.
Okay. So when you want to talk about something, for example, that's culturally relevant, if you were talking about McDonald's, that's something that just about any culture can share or have in common. Okay. Another aspect of culturally relevant pedagogy. So instead of taking a group of urban kids out to the lake that's in the affluent community and digging up water samples, culturally relevant pedagogy would say, why not take a piece of that dirty mattress that's in that vacant lot that they're doing backflips on and show them what they're doing backflips on? Why is that important? It's in their environment. Okay. It's something they see and do and live around every day. So I think when it's a part of their daily culture, or whatever's in their ecology in that particular community. So, for me, I think culturally relevant pedagogy has a huge bandwidth. There's a lot of latitude. And I think, critical race theory the two can easily be melded in such a way that, you are having these courageous conversations and you are given or depicting a true picture of what the history of this country has been like for Black, brown, or Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So it's the question is, or the ask is rather, well, how do you do that, and what does it look like for me? But I'm a big proponent of culturally relevant pedagogy. I do believe in its importance.
Dr. Snyder.
Yeah, a question on this. So I agree with this. And then the thought is in education, especially with youth, part of what you do as an educator, part of what the state sees the purpose of education is to kind of instill a shared connectedness. Like you said, McDonald's unites us all, something like that, right? So in America, the thought is, look, it's life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, it's freedom for all, freedom of expression. And these are the things that we all desire and want for America, right? So the question is, how do you balance this idea of instilling this type of shared commitment to, let's say, the American project, and identify, instead of doing like a total myth where you just deny the past and pretend there's never been racism in America, or America never has any problems, and we've always been doing the right thing always. How do you have this idea where students identify with America, want to help America, want to be a part of the project of America, and still recognize all of the challenges and evils that still persist, or the systematic injustices that their fellow students are going to face, and try to see themselves as part of that? How do we fix that? So one of the questions I think about CRT is, how do we get from this recognition of the various viewpoints that people have, the various total different worlds they face when navigating America, and still see themselves as one group, so they're not just fighting each other, and also improve it? How do we fix it? So that's, I think, where CRT kind of, I don't know, I would say we need something more than this. Right? It's not enough to just identify, hey, there's systematic racism, but then what does CRT provide that allows us to end it?
I think, I completely agree. It's like, 'cause I think, I mean, God bless Michael for spending time on Parler or whatever, because, somebody's got to do that. But I can't for my own sanity. But I think if we're going to take one little, a broken clock is right twice a day, right? So if we want to, for the sake of argument, take that little sliver of the conservative, paranoid critique of CRT that might have some value, it's kind of what Dr. Schneider is speaking to. We still want to foster some sort of collective shared ethos where we all understand that we are all fellow citizens, fellow humans. Some of us have gotten an incredibly raw deal in the past and today, right? We're talking to y'all from North Minneapolis as we speak, right? So how do we actually then use those shared experiences to figure out how we get everybody to a desirable place. So I understand on the more respectable or intellectually honest right, how they want to say, well, you need to make sure there's some sort of goalpost that we can hit, and they worry that CRT takes it away. From my perspective, I don't care as much whether we call it CRT or whether we call it culturally responsive pedagogy, because like I like metal, but that doesn't make me a Slipknot fan. And if I say I like hip hop, it doesn't mean I like Vanilla Ice, right? So it's just like I'm leery of like supporting one brand of educational product or some loosely defined school of scholars over another. But to Derek's point, it's like it's hard for me to argue that culturally responsible criticism makes a lot of sense. CRT could probably be a valuable part of that. So how do we get everyone to stop clawing each other's eyes out over what's some books people wrote in 1989 and figure out how on the ground to empower our teachers to get that learning done? Because the teachers know that we have to get this work done, and this PhD nerd fight from the Reagan administration is kind of a waste of everybody's time, especially when right-wing politicians are using it to shut down educational systems in half the states in America. That's, to me, the scarier thing that we need to be kind of focused on. So
Now, all of you gentlemen have a background in education, and I'm wondering how we. First of all, I don't think that children are as fragile and as what's the word that I want to say here? Part of an intellectual desert that critical race theory is something that's going to draw them into this mental, state that all of a sudden, because I'm white, I should feel a certain kind of way. Because I'm black, I should feel a certain kind of way. My thing is, most of this I see is coming from parents. It's not actually coming from the people that are actually being taught. Are we doing them an injustice by trying to sweep these particular things either under the rug or give them such an idea that these things are all of a sudden bad now, even though they've been existing since, well, we can go back to the 1619 Project. That's another show. Yeah. But, is the educational system really that fragile, Mike?
I mean, the system itself is a mess, James. From one level to the next, there's no coordinated effort. You've got the feds, you've got the states, you've got the districts. It's not a well-designed proposition. It's kind of evolved into what it is, right? For me, I see the main shift to be almost an epistemological shift, which is the idea that we can discover more truth from broader perspectives than we can from singular perspectives. I think that's the main difference between an acceptive institution to culturally responsive pedagogy or teaching versus one that's not. And we have a long history of cognitivist teaching where there's one right answer and it's at the back of the book, and we are trying to force everybody to figure out how to get C on question number 12. And the reality is that C on question number 12 is one person's likely perspective and interpretation, and the reality is the world's far more complicated. And so we need to stop teaching as if there's one answer. And as if it comes from one place, and we need to teach students how to work together to figure out the world around them. And in doing so, they'll figure out innately that their different perspectives are a power and not a deficit.
I agree, and I think the first step in that is teachers and their ability to build authentic relationships with students. Okay. I forget who it was. I believe it was Roosevelt who said, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care."
100%.
Okay. And so if I'm a young African American male walking into any school in Minneapolis public schools, and I show up there and I have people who can't foster and build authentic relationships with me, and I'm not allowed to show up with my culture and all that comes with me, okay, and be my authentic self in that space. This is why I hate the term teaching. I prefer the term coaches, because what do coaches do? Coaches also teach, but they build relationships. Okay. They foster a sense of pride, a sense of worth, a sense of uniqueness, a sense of oneness, if you will. So when you talk about what the big brouhaha is around critical race theory, I think it's real simple. You just said it. You said, I think it's the parents. Well, the first assertion of critical race theory is that racism is a social construct. So who are those parents? How many generations old are they? Okay. They're operating from a belief system and an ideology that supports who and what they are and what their values have taught them, to be true. Okay. And now take George Floyd, take the recent riots. We got this whole cancel culture thing going on. Okay. And you take the recent riots. You didn't just see black people out there.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's what I mean by culture and its diversity. Okay. And its complexity. I think CRT is also complex in the sense that what racism looks like from one person to the next is very different. Okay. And so I think that's where it kind of gets lost in the sauce a little bit, because there is no one general definition, of what it is or what racism is or how it looks like or what it feels like from one person to the next. And
that's perfectly put. I think Michael is raised. You both raised the exact points. And Derek, I'm gonna make you go tell my dean that I need to be a coach and not a teacher, because I do it every week and they won't listen to me. So I'm in favor. But to Michael's also raising the point that everyone's too afraid to say. Critical race theory, like a lot of really complex academic ideas, is pretty tricky at the graduate level. It's pretty tricky in the law school classroom. So by the time you're filtering that down through a school board and a textbook company and some teacher who maybe doesn't want to be there or doesn't really know what they're doing, especially during, after the murder of Floyd, I totally get how even with the best intentions, people could be screwing that up on the ground. That is not the reason you stop doing it, right? Like, not everyone can play zone defense. We don't give up on it. Not everyone can shoot a three-pointer, and we don't say, well, we're never doing that again. So to Michael's point, you probably shouldn't have the answer on your test, true or false, your parents are racist. That is probably not a smart way to do that. But you're talking about a critical race theory, which comes out of critical legal studies. You're talking about a body of work that was just about a very simple thing in law schools. Hey, when somebody is trying to file as a plaintiff or a defendant a lawsuit, and it happens to be that they're intersectionally not just female, but also African American, and not just Asian, but also disabled, wouldn't it be swell if the law recognized both those categories at the same time so they didn't get screwed? Like Crenshaw's intersectionality essay isn't any more complicated than that. And what that turned into was a movement within law schools 40 years ago that said, hey, we should probably be paying more attention to the lived experience of our Black professors and our African-American defendants, and we should be talking more about how the lived experience of white folks and not white folks are different in legal contexts, because the law is all about storytelling anyway. Like, none of this was revolutionary in the law schools, because law schools are already about competing stories. It wasn't like they were trying to blow up the Enlightenment or saying there's no truth or everybody's perspective matters the same, even Gwyneth Paltrow's. They were just trying to say, hey, if my defendant or my client has intersectional ways in which the system's screwing with them, can we just acknowledge that and be honest and move on? And but when I was in grad school in the early 2000s, frankly, they considered it boring. I went to grad school to be a critical legal studies person, and they're like, McCain, that stuff's done. Then I take my critical race theory classes. They're like, yeah, man, that's kind of done too. We're kind of shifting to like, we all agree on this. Now let's figure out how we fix medicine and law. So this is just it's a non-issue if it's taught well and taught responsibly and taught with the spirit of all the kids in the classroom being coached to understand everyone's diverse experiences and how we actually fix stuff. And I think that's the shame of this current fight, where suddenly it's illegal or at the very least financially not in your interest to be talking about race in the classroom in America in 2021, which might be the most racist thing I've ever heard.
Dr. Snyder, I'm going to go back here a little bit, because it seems to me that, we went through this with the Rodney King story, so I guess I'm dating myself a little bit here. But, what happened between the repair of race relations during Rodney King, during the Rodney King era, and we're still talking about this same relations in 2021. Where was there a disconnect in these 40 years or 20 years, whatever it was?
It's a great question, because
you asked it like a half hour ago, actually.
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. That's the philosopher's answer is I don't know, right? But the things you notice in America is I think it came in late, but the polarization of society, these fragmented viewpoints, people not communicating to each other, and this is one way to look at it, right? So we have a case where there's a proportion of our society or culture doesn't want something taught in schools because they think it's false, they think it's harmful, or something like that. But instead of debating critical race theory, they're just trying to ban it. They're just trying to outright just use a powerful move to just prevent this from being taught in the schools. And that's a case of, I guess, abandoning discourse, abandoning communication, abandoning sharing each other's viewpoints and talking things and explaining things to each other, and just saying, we find this hurtful, we don't want our kids to be exposed to this, so we're going to pretend it doesn't exist. And we could say maybe that's what happened in America. Right after Rodney King, it's a case where I'm from the Midwest, where it's just like, well, that happened there, doesn't happen here. We don't talk about it. And it was not to be talked about. And then it's something I think Michael brought up, is that it seems like every generation of, I don't want to say conservatives, but maybe it's like white people like to say, like, racism, yeah, that happened in the past, but it's taken care of. It's gone now.
Obama was president.
And then in your head, my kids are going to look at me and be like, what were you doing? What were you doing when this occurred? What was your reaction? And I think it's just a case of parents being uncomfortable with letting their kids know, like, yeah, I was part of a unjust system.
Well, and I think to that point, we can't ignore the timing of this critical race theory brouhaha, right? I mean, like, it isn't. So we know early in the administration, Trump's got some nerd who went to a decent school in the cabinet, and he decides that kid's still mad about that prof who made him learn about the history of slavery in 1995, and he's going to get him and all that. So all of a sudden, Trump's talking about critical race theory. They're also talking about the Frankfurt School and post-structuralism and all kinds of stuff they only half understand. So it's always been a last-ditch power move on the right to go after, we called it political correctness in the 90s after Rodney King. Now we're calling it critical race theory. When there's nothing left in their golf bag, they like trotting this old horse out because it gets their base fired up. It lets them feel like their children are being stolen from them. And let's face it, as somebody who teaches at an evangelical school that hosted the George Floyd funeral, these are some weird Thanksgivings my kids are going home to, because they are not putting up their parents' bullshit anymore. And I understand when grandpa and grandma and mom and dad want to blame somebody but themselves for voting for insurrectionists, for questioning the murder of George Floyd, and for lying to their kids in some case for a long time about the fact that systemic racism is real. And I think we're witnessing a generation of kids on the right and left who might actually finally get some racial progress happening. I like that Derek pointed out it wasn't just black folk out in the street in Minneapolis, it was everybody. And I think that's this reckoning that the parents
Generation Z is different.
dealing with. Exactly. They're on the other side of history. They want to blame somebody, and they want to blame a book from 1987 that no one read.
But here's the root cause of that fear. You know, there's a group, if you will, of white people who just basically think that CRT promotes racism against white people in order for black people to see equity. That's what it's steeped in.
Yeah, you know, I see it. I'm right with you. I see CRT as an addition to people who actually take the time to try to understand it. It is an additional layer of responsibility. Like, I think my answer to the question, you didn't ask me, James, but I have a thought about Rodney King versus now. I think between Rodney King and now, people, generally white people, viewed racism as overt, discreet, directed, and now we're starting to tell them, well, hey, maybe you've remember the Jim Crow laws. Maybe you've heard of, this legal or gerrymandering, all of these different things that like have a major impact on generational wealth for people of color. They couldn't buy homes. They couldn't go to banks. Like, there were reasons why. It wasn't even as the parable talks about going to the race, taking the chains off and starting. You were still on an uphill incline while everyone else was going downhill. I mean, it's another layer of responsibility, and I think people want to be done with it. They're like, listen, I felt guilty enough, but I've made personal changes. Who's bringing this up again, right? I thought we all moved on. And so this feels like hey, come back. We're not done with you. If you look at it from that perspective, I don't see it as much as ignorance, as much as the emotionally driven nature of humanity wanting to avoid having to reconstruct their whole life meaning, especially if somebody who looks different is telling you got to do it.
Derek, when I think about education, especially within our Black community, I think that we have generations that don't know the difference between Jim Crow and Jim Beam. What's your thoughts on that?
Facts, and I think what has been lost over time is that your generation, my generation, and even to a degree, part of the millennials, it was drilled into you. If you want to change your situation, if you want to change your environment, if you want to enhance your life, the best way to accomplish that or achieve that is through education. Okay. I look at schools today. When I went to school, if the teacher said X, Y, and Z, it was law. She better not call Big Mama. Or she better not call, because you knew what was coming when you got home. But now, a teacher say something to a kid hop on their cell phone, text mom and daddy up at the school finna hit the teacher over the head. Let's keep it a buck. Let's tell it like it is. And right. So, I think we've gotten away from the value of education. I'm a product of South High, Minneapolis Public Schools. I went to Kenwood Elementary School. I went to Southwest for a while. So, and some of these were schools where I'm living in the projects over north. Okay, the old projects that were torn down, but I'm being bussed around all these mansions, and I'm going to school in the Kenwood neighborhood. I'm out here on 46th and Chowan at Southwest. My white peers are driving up in BMW, Saabs, Audis, and I'm like, oh, wow. Okay. How'd you get that? Oh, through that education thing? Got it. I want some. So it for I say that to say for my generation, I know for a fact, man, when I I'm not going to say that Minneapolis public schools or any school district in the state of Minnesota where there's a large proportion of students of color. I'm not going to say that it's perfect by any stretch, but I know what it was when I was a student in that system. And I know I grew up poor. And if I can come out of that system and have 2 master's degrees and be a therapist, a psychotherapist, and do the things that I'm doing, you know, there are more resources in these schools than there ever were when we went to school. Okay. You know, so I just think it comes down to one's individual value system. I tell my clients all the time, live a value-driven life. Live your life according to your mission and vision for your life. And if you're doing anything that's not aligned with your vision for your life, then it's wrong. Show me your friends, show me what's in your ecology, and I'll show you your future if you don't have a plan to change it. Simple.
I'm going to kind of bring an experience that I know none of you are familiar with, but I think it's very critical to what we're talking about. And I'm going to bring up incarceration because I have been incarcerated. Now, my thought on that, and when you think of critical race theory and when you think of anything else, when you are incarcerated or any time that maybe you're sick, maybe you're isolated, but that's a good time to do some self-education and go into and look at things that maybe you were too busy or doing something that you had no business doing, and now you take this time to do something constructive. Now, I'm also thinking that critical race theory is kind of, like, once again, I'm showing my age here, but it kind of seemed like the same conversation that we had about affirmative action.
To a degree.
Am I wrong here?
No, and I think there's two, to answer your question, James. Derek and Michael both hit on something I think is a really important context that no one's seeing. First off, if you actually look at what critical race theory, and like anything else, like jazz or hip hop or what is baseball, it's harder to define. But at the core of it, it's saying these stories that people tell about their lived experience have an academic and educational value. So when they're talking about banning critical race theory, what you literally are saying is Derek couldn't tell his story of his experience in the school district in Minneapolis because that is somehow verboten. So like, it really is that crazy. The other part of it that is so dangerous that I'm furious that these attorney generals signed that letter because they know better is what Michael brought up, which is Jim Crow. There is a system that is not in the future. It's not science fiction. It's not Black Mirror. There's a system of algorithmic Jim Crow, which legal scholars who are in the intersection of digital ethics and critical race theory have been screaming bloody murder about for 5 years. The Institute for Digital Humanity, my group, helped get racist facial recognition technology banned in Minneapolis by the use of police. And the reason they're able to do that is the scholars' evidence is irrefutable. Facial recognition does not work on faces of color. There are people incarcerated wrongly all over the country because these stupid RoboCops. So at a moment in history, which will probably be the most important moment of the civil rights movement, when systemic racism is being programmed into predictive policing, to credit scores, to HUD now will use algorithms to discriminate against poor people in medical care, in employment. The fact that these conservative attorney generals have the balls to outlaw teaching racial discrimination when they know damn well that this is what their police departments, this is what their local corporations, this is what the federal government are all doing. I do not like conspiracies, and I don't like when people randomly connect dots. But if they didn't know that they were doing that, their stupidity should get them voted out, because that is such an affront. And to go back to the affirmative action question, James, it's all connected, because at the end of the day, even like conservative kids today aren't denying the value of affirmative action in getting some different faces in the classroom, in the front of the classroom, in the back of the classroom. We've just accepted this as a good experiment that we tried. And so the fact that we're going to rehash that debate over critical race theory at a time when in the legal community that work is so essential to civil rights is even double glaring and really, really repugnant, frankly. So,
You want to comment on that, Dr. Snyder?
He's the AI.
Michael?
Yeah, that's a real thing. And, there have been numerous examples, including even Google. One I just thought of was Google mapping high crime areas that caused people to not be able to find businesses or be discouraged from patronizing businesses that were in neighborhoods that had statistically higher crime rates. The idea of algorithmic decision making and bias are absolutely inextricably connected because they're written by people with singular perspectives. So that's a whole nother topic, is the importance of multi perspectives in advanced computing. But I think it goes back to, I don't know, like, I'm not incredibly politically savvy, but to me it seems like the attorneys general were pandering to their base. It's just a public flag waving of, hey, I'm on, what team I'm on, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Derek, what about equal opportunity? Do you think that was one of the crumbs that we accepted in the Black community, but didn't really follow through with it?
I'm not sure I fully understand your question. Can you?
What I'm saying is, when we supposedly, just like the Civil Rights Act, supposedly the Equal Opportunity Bill gave Black and brown people the chance to go to school.
Mm-hmm.
They gave us a chance to uplift ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, so what I'm saying is, was that a false doctrine?
No, not at all, because I think there are scores of us who took advantage of that. However, I think every person's story and every person's experience or lived experience is vastly different. And it really comes down to, are you emotionally intelligent enough in the moment to take advantage of that? What do you have going on within your ecology, in terms of formal and informal supports that help you be successful? Not everybody has that. What coping skills do you have at your disposal that allow you to navigate the pitfalls of life? You talk about acceptance and commitment therapy. One of the tenets of that modality is that every day you wake up, you're gonna have some shit on the bottom of your shoe. Okay? Every day. Life is gonna happen. By hook or by crook. It will happen. How do you deal? How do you cope? How do you respond? Well, what typically happens in Black and brown communities is that by the time help comes from us, what was once a serious problem is now a full-blown freaking crisis. Okay? And so you're already starting below board, and you spend years busting your chops just to peek your head up a little bit and say, I can't take quite a full deep breath, but at least I can get a little air, And so you never really, if you lack the informal and formal supports and you lack an ecology that's supportive, and you lack the skills and tools and resources to propel yourself to a different station in life, it's just hard. It's hard. And so because I did it doesn't mean the next person can. So the ask as a therapist that I always go, it's that whole solution focus concept. What's the magical question? If it could all be different for you, what would it look like? Okay. Because once you can define for me what that looks like for you, now I can start to work with you from a strength-based perspective. Now I can help you establish and build your own self-efficacy skills so that you can make informed decisions about what happens to you in your life and where you go with it. So I think, we have to be careful about saying who took advantage of what, or did we not fully capitalize because we all start at very different points, okay, and we all have different vices and forces pulling against us, so that would be my take on that.
Dr. McCain and Dr. Snyder, Derek referred a little while ago to teachers as being coaches. Using that type of analogy, one thing that you have to have in your coach is trust. How do we get the trust of Generation Z when we've really brought the problems to the forefront that they have to deal with probably for the rest of their life and for their kids' lives?
I would say that's a big question. I don't know how to totally answer that, but I would say in relation to what we're talking about, I think
I'm not known for giving out easy questions.
so the simple answer I'm going to give
This is Fox News, right?
CRT, right? Like banning discussion from a course is a way to lose trust, right? If I'm a student and I think my teacher is giving me some rote answer or presenting claims about history, which I know is wrong, or my community knows is wrong, and they're not being open about it to discuss something, that destroys trust. And if I know the government itself or the politicians are preventing discussions or promoting obvious myths that don't track my lived experience, then you lose all trust. So certainly, if there are problems with CRT, and I think there's problems with any intellectual endeavor, any theorizing, I don't think anyone's proposed the full truth, the full explanation of the human experience and presented the best way or the perfect way to categorize it. So it's not a perfect system. We can criticize it, but to prevent its discussion and its debate is a non-starter. Right? That's the end of trust. So I think, again, discussion is the way to do it. And just one thing that came up with what Derek said is, I remember, and I guess this is your question, James, but with when I was in high school, we did debates. We had, it was a nice high school, there was debates, and we debated about affirmative action, right? But it was a bunch of white kids arguing about whether affirmative action was justified or not. It wasn't until I left high school, right? I go to college, I meet African American students, I start having conversations with people. You realize, hey, my perspective from Omaha, Nebraska about affirmative action as a 16-year-old kid was incomplete. I didn't know what I was talking about or what I was thinking about. And so to me, the big threat about the current dialogue about CRT in America is really that they're just trying to restrict and prevent other conceptions of American history, other viewpoints of how America was forged, what happened in the past, and other narratives about events, right? So that's just, to me, a total mistake. The best way I can put it.
I agree completely with what Dr. Schneider is saying. I think I'd add this one thing. I've been teaching for about 1 million years. From the remaining hair on my head and the gray on my face, but the difference with I started
distinguished, very distinguished,
distinguished, exactly. I started grad school on. I showed up for grad school on September 11th. Okay, what I have seen now, having done this for a couple decades, is this current group of students, our current college freshmen, have been through the ringer. Like, think about how miserable of a haul they've had. Parents lost their gigs during the recession, so they might have been sleeping in cars. They don't trust the stock market. They don't trust the housing market. Then they get Trump. Then they get Floyd. Then they get the pandemic. So they are no longer going to sit idly by and do nothing. They all have multiple jobs. They have skills. They're entrepreneurs. I think they're going to be our next greatest generation. They work like our grandparents, not like our siblings, not like our nephews, not like our, older Gen Z kids with their avocado toast or whatever that nonsense is about. So I think what they are hungry for, and the lesson I learned, so I left a cushy tenure-track job to cross the filter bubble. And what impressed me interacting with students who I didn't know anything about, evangelical kids, I didn't know anything about that culture, none of it, is the difference was I could stand up and talk about algorithmic discrimination, or I could stand up and talk about other injustices. And if I didn't have an action step at the end of that class, they had no respect for me and no time for me. So the reason why, and I give them a shout out because it's all on them, the reason why a ragtag group of mainly of color 19-year-olds work with the Anti-Defamation League and the ACLU and Indiana University and Netflix coded bias and got legislation passed is because they're sick of waiting around for all of us to do something. And if there is a sinister motive for CRT being shut down, it's because these kids are winning and the other side might be running scared. And I think that's the nature of being a coach instead of a teacher. That's the nature of what Dr. Schneider's talking about fostering trust. But I think we're about to have a new 1968 moment or even like, I don't know, 1940 moment with this generation. And I think the people who've been in power too long are getting scared. And, they're on the wrong side of history. They maybe should be. I don't necessarily mean that means high school students should be radicalized or all acting like activists or all that. I teach at the college level. But at the college level, these kids want education, solutions, the truth, and a path to go fix stuff. They don't have time to wait around for us anymore.
You want to talk about building that trust in those relationships? Genuineness, empathy, having a sense of compassion, okay, and creating a space for them that allows them to show up and be their authentic selves, okay, free of any constructs or labels or things of the like. As a social worker and therapist, I mean, that's engagement 101. Okay, there it is. If I meet you and I shake your hand and I get a shitty feeling from you, dude, I'll catch you in traffic. Okay. See you when I see you type thing. So I really think it's about how you foster and nurture that relationship, with this younger generation.
Mike, you are an English teacher, and to me, when I was coming up in school, this was part of social studies. So for you to have the trust of your students to be able to combine the two that most people would consider on totally irrelevant to each other, English versus CRT or culture. I mean, we would expect you to be talking about Shakespeare and, defining some type of theory about that last paragraph that I just wrote. What did you do to gain the trust of your students in order for you to be able to explore these extracurricular type of subjects and situations?
James, who was that for?
You.
Oh, so I wasn't an English teacher. That's why I'm like, I don't know who he's talking to. So no, I'm an education guy. So my doctorate's in education. I focus on educational technology. I was a high school bio teacher for a couple of years. Authenticity, to Derek's point. But I agree with Dr. McCain that I think this generation is way too impatient for and untrusting for them to even rely upon us. I think in order for us to gain their trust, we would first have to, especially since we're bringing them a problem, we would have to acknowledge that we fucked up. And they would have to take care of it, right? And we're not doing that. As you can tell, 19 attorneys general just wrote statements that not saying that. So I give that 0% chance of coming to fruition.
Dr. McCain and Dr. Snyder, I know I took you away from your families. We can either take your last thoughts now or you can continue with our conversation. We have about another 30 minutes or so.
We do have to bounce. We really, really appreciate this.
This was great.
We'd be welcome. We'd be thrilled to do it any time, and I'm going to harass all of you. But this is the conversation that has to be happening. This is the way this conversation has to happen. And we all know And James, I really want to congratulate you. The value of these podcast spaces where we actually get into these issues in an intelligent way, that is the fifth column. That is the thing that has to keep happening, because right now, even the people who could be potential allies are caught between the idiotic Fox News narratives and the cat lady NPR narratives. And we all know that the truth and solutions are in the middle. So we really appreciate it, man. We so much. Thank you.
All right. Do you have any social media, gentlemen, that we should look at, or some papers or anything, that we should read?
We can send. We have some writings on algorithmic discrimination and critical race theory. We'd be happy to forward those. The Institute for Digital Humanities website is www.institutefordigitalhumanity.org, and that has their social media as well. So please follow to see what these kids are up to, because they're going to fix the world. So we really appreciate.
I have a quick question for you before you go.
Yeah.
Have you read White Teachers, Diverse Classrooms by Dr. Chance Lewis and Julie Lansman?
No, but it sounds like I'm about to.
Okay. Very good stuff. It really speaks to culturally relevant pedagogy.
All right, thank you.
Duly noted, man. I'll get on it. I appreciate it. Take care, y'all. It was great talking to you.
Thank you, sir. You have a great night.
You too.
So, gentlemen, let's talk about some of the legislation that's in front of our current legislators, as well as some of the things that have really bothered me. I wrote a blog called Mansion, the Enabler. And when we talk about how our generation, or this generation, has done more to we presented more problems to the future generations than ever. But when you see some of the things that are going on within society, especially, you have a whole part of society that says that the insurrection never happened. This was a tour that, just maybe got out of hand, for a few minutes, but this never happened. So not only are we being given these type of oppressive laws throughout our states, but we're also told not to believe the things that we see. Now, if you want to talk about fake news, as you can see here, I had the word Vietnam on my chest.
Right.
If you want to talk about fake news, I think I'm a pretty good guy to start about that with, because we were actually depicted as anything but soldiers when we came back from Vietnam. So perception kind of rules the roost, as they say. What are your perceptions of what we need to do in order to stop some of the things that we see that are actually reoccurring within our days? When you start talking about Jim Crow laws, I mean, even prisoners of war are given water. So I'm going to start with you, Derek, on this one.
I don't know. It's again, very broad question, but at the same time, I really think it speaks to what we were talking about with critical race theory systems. Okay, we're in a country, you all, with systems that have been in play centuries. Okay, and it's so woven into the fabric of who we are and how we operate. It's I forget his name. I forget who it was, but he stands up in one voice and kind of denounces Trump's actions, okay, and says, that he would vote to impeach and all of those kinds of things. But then A week later does an about face. Why? Because the construct is set up. There are loopholes in it. It allows them to do that. And it wasn't about Trump. It's really about his political party. And how does it allow them to stay in power? Okay? So that privilege continues to flow and grow. You know? It's all systemic.
I'd like to welcome Dan to our conversation. Dan, how are you doing this evening?
Good. How are you tonight?
Dan, we had actually started a different conversation. We're talking about the CRT as it pertains to some of the current legislation and education of our kids. And the question that I wanted to ask you, what do you think about the impending laws that 43 states have passed, according, using voter suppression? They don't. Yeah, I mean, although it's not said, it's inferred by voting after church, for instance, which is a big portion of how brown and black people. That's part of it's almost like a dress up occasion. You go to church, you meet your friends, you all go to vote, so forth and so on. It's kind of like a fellowship. But what do you think, when you look at how race has taken such a part of a 2021 conversation?
I think it's clearly not an accident. I think the reason doing it is clearly for people of color to vote. It's very obvious that's what they're up to. As far as the legislation, exactly what.
I think we have Dan on somewhat of a delay here.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. I said I think it's done deliberately to keep people of color from voting. I think that's what it is all, that are sort of legislation.
Michael, we were talking about how education, federally funded, state funded, and is there any way that we can standardize education? I mean, there used to be a thing back, once again, pointing my age, we had standardized tests. Now, I'm not saying that those were, actually a level playing field, but at least we had a starting point. Do we have that now?
Oh yeah, yeah. We have standards and substandards and extra standards, and that's part of the problem. I would argue, James. Honestly, that's almost maybe the opposite of CRT from a critical, or a cultural relevant teaching. Is the people who made the standards all look like me. And female versions of me. And those standards are based in cultural relevance and cultural importance that doesn't fly across all spectrum. And so I would argue that part of the reason why education is so bad is because of the standards we've chosen. And they're very often knowledge related. That's very much knowledge acquisition and taking tests, multiple choice tests, which again have that one right answer, and yet we know life is nothing like that. The last time I had a problem that was of any significance where I had 4 choices and one was the right one, I can't remember. But that's the way we've set it up. To me, it goes back almost to the opposite of like incredibly standard-based teaching to almost a Montessori constructivist perspective of allow people to pursue their passions, their interests. There's a trillion ways to learn how to read, and it doesn't have to be Shakespeare. We don't have to get people to try to ingest things that they have no connection to or desire to be related to. I mean, if you think about it, the main thing in both the CRTs is culture, and culture is thick. We don't see it, but it's the air we swim in, right? It's the reason why I didn't show up to this with my shirt off, right? Because I know culturally, the expectation is that I'm going to be clothed while we're on television, right? So, but the reality is that, and anyone who's ever walked into a community, an organization, or a group of people and felt like, holy shit, I don't belong here, knows what culture is. Because probably there wasn't a sign. I mean, back in the days, let's say us, right? I walked, even thinking about going to, talking to a group of computer engineers. They have a shared understanding that I don't. They use language that I don't. They know stories that I don't. And for me to try to learn computer science through a cultural lens that I have no relation to, is a gigantic barrier. So rather than the standards, rather than sort of that standardization, the idea being let's let people figure out through their own cultural lens how to achieve the objectives. Famous study, and then I'll stop talking. It's not famous, actually. There was a study that I'm aware of that was actually by Professor at UW Madison, named Constance Steinkuhler, and she did a study where basically she showed that if you give kids, seventh grade kids, boys in particular, you give them standard curriculum and you ask them to improve their reading, they hardly make a dent in it. If you get a reading level book that's related to something they're interested in, like video games, their level of reading will go up like crazy because they care about the thing. And right now we have standards no one cares about, and they're certainly not culturally responsive.
It's interesting you said that. If I may, I
Please.
Was the cultural competency coordinator for St. Paul Public Schools back in 2007, and had the whole achievement gap issue. I think proficiency on the reading scores were, I think, what was it, 850 for eighth graders or something like that. So you had all of these kids, these bubble kids. So, it's interesting what you said, because this is exactly what we did. We switched out the grapes of wrath. Okay. The so-called American classic.
How dare you, sir? How dare you, sir?
Right. That these kids didn't give a shit about. They just could care less. And we swapped that for a poetry series by Jill Scott, who's an R&B artist, but who also does some writing, some poetry writing. But the big part of that was we read Stanley Tookie Williams' Life in Prison, and so. Oh,
beautiful.
He was,
all of a sudden it makes sense. It's interesting. It matters.
In
That's
class,
the importance.
On task, dialed in, telling you everything about it. And oh wow, he was a Nobel Prize. Oh yeah, even in prison with a death sentence.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you want to talk about culturally relevant pedagogy, there it is at its finest. Taking something that, because these kids, they see gangs, they may have family members or people in their community, things. Okay, here's a guy who had a vast life, a set of life experiences, who was ultimately executed, but toward the end of his life did some really remarkable things from inside a 6x9 cell. Okay. And it resonated with these kids, because they had heard about who he was, but didn't have any real information. And it was just really cool to see how engrossed those students were in the actual material, and to watch those kids at the end of that spring when they took the placement test, or not placement test, I forget what they call them, state standards test or whatever, to see the majority of those kids, even if they were at 825, but to see them shoot up to an 847 where they're that close to play. There were some who passed, but then there were some who still, there were some remarkable gains made. And so, to your point, I just wanted to share that little tidbit. But you're spot on.
I relate to both of you gentlemen, but I also have kind of a pushback on that.
Okay.
Because I understand what you're saying when you talk about, being able to relate and things that they can relate to and how it gives you a certain amount of influence. I'm from the inner city. Grew up in the inner city in Newark. I actually ran away from Youngstown from one inner city to go to one that was even worse. As I said before, ended up incarcerated and had a rather violent reputation around the neighborhood. At my age, when I go to the hood, I'm still considered an OG. It doesn't matter what accomplishments I did in between the time that I was actually incarcerated and what I've done for the last 40 years. I still get the respect as the OG. Now, because of that, I can talk about other things, but it's not those other things that they identify with. Dan, is that a problem?
I think it's the same thing, James. I think you're starting with what they know, and then you're using that to bring them to places that they don't know. But if you just start taking them to the places that they don't know, then you know, unless they trust you, which is the respect that you're talking about. So that's the challenge, right? Is that school is made up of people that are not like James. They do not earn the trust of those folks. They do not take them under their wing and show them things that they didn't see before. They have standards and expectations and rules, and that's the game they're playing. So I think you're actually saying the same thing in a slightly different way, which is you can't access things that are not within your grasp, until you get to that next step. And a lot of folks never get anywhere because it's not interesting, it's not relevant. And guess what? I'm hungry at home. We've got problems. Like, my mind is not in school. You're never going to get to the good stuff unless you're able to draw them in a way that allows them to grow.
Well, I agree with that, Michael, and because when I talk about that particular seventh grade class or whatever that I had, the conversations that we were able to have around Tukey Williams's book, and just because everybody identified with the Crip in him, right?
Right.
But they had no idea that he had written children's books and had done all of these other things. So, when you design that lesson plan and you ask some of those critical questions about, just exploratory questions around how different do you think his life could have been, if he wasn't affiliated, I mean, writing children's books, winning a Nobel Prize, appearing on shows from prison, just think about it, and it allows you as the educator or facilitator of said group to kind of shape the thinking, if you will, in terms of, hey, you don't always have to be a badass. You don't always have to necessarily be the OG, Here's an OG who lived his life and made some decisions that cost him and really possibly stymied what could have been a stellar career. Who knew he had it in him? But to your point earlier, James, when you're in there, you can't do nothing but self-reflect. that time has a way of humbling you. Okay, and there is a level of introspection that happens for sure. And he found his, obviously.
Dan, can you have some contributions here? You look like you were froze there for a minute.
Oh no, I was.
James,
I see somebody peeking around the corner. Go ahead, Doc.
I apologize. I got to jump off. I think Derek
So do
does
I.
too,
Yeah, I do.
unfortunately. But I just wanted to say thank you. It's been an incredible conversation, and I really enjoyed meeting you, Derek, and
Likewise.
the other guests.
I got some paperwork that's waiting for me, gentlemen.
I got my dinner.
Hey, you're not the only one, but fortunately, I'm out here in California, so it's only 7:30. I can't complain. Mike, would you like to give us your final thoughts? Tell us any works anywhere that people might be able to find you, or if you got any social media, and then we'll do Derek.
Love it, man. Yeah, I'm going to do the same thing I always do, which is just thank you for creating a space where we can have an intelligent conversation, where we can exchange ideas, where we can see things from other people's perspective and walk away better for it. So I said it before, I never imagined I'd be on a political podcast as a semi-regular guest. So thanks for you're the OG that brought me into this into this category. So thank you, sir. That's all.
No,
Hey, I appreciate you, sir. You have a great night, and I look forward to having you back on the show.
Yeah, no, I'd just like to echo Michael's comments as well. Just thanks for the platform. Thanks for inviting me out to, just kind of share some of my thoughts and views, and then to really just kind of have an opportunity to learn from the perspective of others, who shared their insights here tonight. And thank you for the very thoughtful and tough questions, because it really does provoke thought, and it leaves you something to take away from the conversation and ponder for later conversations down the road. So I thank you for that, man, and would love to be a guest on your show again.
Oh, most definitely, and I want to talk about your Vikings too. I got a sports.
Man, I am not a Vikings fan. I am a Tennessee Titan fan.
Oh my goodness, that's even better. We can talk about the Julio trade, the whole 9 yards. I'll send you an invitation to the sports crib. I'm glad to have a Titan fan. I got a Denver Broncos fan. I got a Detroit Lions fan. Of course, I guess you can see where my loyalty is, but so.
Let's do it. I'm always available for that. All right, guys, I got to bounce later.
All right, you have a great one.
You too. Bye-bye.
Dan, what is your thoughts on the teaching of critical race theory in education?
Well, before I'd like to comment on a few of the things that were discussed earlier. Is that okay?
Okay. Yes. Feel free.
You were talking about standardized testing, and I don't know. In Pennsylvania, I know that we still do standardized testing for one of the elementary school grades and 8th grade. Those are something called PSSAs, and then later on in high school they have something called a Keystone. In Pennsylvania, they have one for English, one for math, one for biology, I believe, and those are all things that supposedly the students are supposed to be able to pass before they can graduate. So yeah, there is a degree of standardized testing, and I would say there's good things and bad things about standardized testing. I think that one of the good things about it is it does kind of demonstrate that a school is teaching certain skills that a student would need to have in order to be successful in a job or a career. One of the bad things about the standardized testing is we do end up teaching to the test, unfortunately. But because the school actually gets a grade itself, and so we actually get a grade ourselves, part on how well students do on standardized tests. So, so for a good year, we teach to the test, and for me, it's not really all that rough because it's primarily grammar. I teach grammar mostly as far as standardized test goes. the sad thing about it is sometimes it monopolizes so much of your time that it doesn't give you opportunities to maybe teach things that might be more socially relevant, things that maybe are more culturally relevant. For example, well, before I give an example, one gentleman, I believe it was Derek was his name.
Yes.
And he was saying about how you give them something to read that's a subject of interest, they will read more. They'll be more enthusiastic about reading, which is true. There is quite a bit of truth to that. What I used to do in my classroom until COVID rolled around is I knew a lot of my students, especially the boys, would read Sports Illustrated. So I would always order Sports Illustrated for my classroom, and then I just leave it lying around on the bookshelf. And if anybody wanted to read it during study hall, they could Sports Illustrated and pass it around. And later on, some boys were interested in cars, car and driver, and that sort of thing. And I noticed they would do that. And so there is a real benefit that a student relates to, that student interest. And I suppose that would go along with one's culture also. My one comment about the culture, though, is like the school district where I teach, I would say it's like 90 to 95% white. So that's the culture that those kids are familiar with. But the way I kind of feel about it, in order for students, let's say, culturally sophisticated, they should know about culture other than, white culture. So as much as I can, I try to introduce them to other cultures. And what I tell them is just because another country does something differently than you, just because something's different doesn't make it bad. It doesn't make it wrong. It's just that's how somebody else does something. And so in order to make my students like a little more culturally sophisticated, I do try to introduce them to new things that maybe initially they wouldn't be all that interested in, but I try to find some way or other to connect it to their own life. Like, maybe say like, this is how these folks do this. What do we do kind of similar to that, and how do we differently kind of compare and contrast? Um, so but that way, at least I'm kind of introducing students to other ways of looking at things, rather than just the mindset of the particular community that I live in. So I've rambled for quite a bit.
No, one of the things that I referred to, and Derek and some of the other gentlemen, because you're all educators, and one of the things that I referred to is that in order for you to be able to introduce new things to students, the students have to have a certain amount of respect and trust for you as an educator.
Right.
So therefore, it's easier for you to introduce something new than, say, the vice principal, just to give an example. I mean, maybe in your school, the vice principal in my school had a certain reputation. So I'm just, maybe I'm stereotyping here, but I'm just saying that you have a closer relationship with your students than an administrator.
Right.
So when I look at some of the things that you have told me that you've taught, in an English class, how were you able to get your students to trust you enough to accept that type of curriculum? Because I'm sure it's probably much different than a lot of other teachers in your school.
Well, let's say, I think, like I said, part of this the relationship I have with students, and I'm fortunate that they pretty like you always have a few of them that just aren't going to like like me, I guess, regardless of what I do. Sometimes personalities just rub the wrong way. But I've been fortunate. Most of the classes I've had, most of the students kind of like my sense of humor. I kind of have a little bit of a sarcastic sense of humor sometimes, and I'll make fun of things. Like if there's like some that doesn't surface, I'll kind of make fun of it. And, we'll have some that's silly sentences, just kind of fool around a little bit. And thought maybe that goes some way to having students trust me to. I think I mentioned to you in one of my text with I teach the novel The Watsons Go to Birmingham, 1960.
Right.
Have you read the book ever?
No, I've never read it, and when I saw it, I said, "This is something that I'm going to have to look at," because it was a book that I had never heard of, and I was wondering how you would, adopt that to an English class. But it does seem to be a book more about the life or the experiences of the family, rather than
the family. They're in Flint, Michigan, and they're in Africa. And the book's hilarious, and I tell the students, you'll really like the first 2/3 of it are absolutely hilarious, and it's point of view of this. I think he's about a 10-year-old boy, smart little boy, has an older brother that's kind of a little more of a nice little parents, but they as American folks, and so it's all stuff that a lot of this stuff is stuff that a kid could relate to. But hold on a second here. A lot of it's stuff that any kid could relate to, but every once in a while they'll work something that might be an issue that my students might be being, practically white. Then I'll take a moment, like when we're reading it, and say, what that means? Why do you think that's the case there? And then we'll have a conversation about it. So it kind of comes up in the literature rather than me kind of standing up there being some sort of preacher of social doctrine. It just kind of comes up naturally in the literature. That's one way I kind of do that.
Speaking of,
I'm going to have to. Okay.
Speaking of your students, and you were saying that you're from a predominantly white school, and you were talking. We talked about some of the advantages that you could possibly have over a family from Flint, Michigan, for instance. Are there ever times when you find that your students discuss CRT as white privilege?
I don't think the students are familiar with even the term CRT right now. White privilege in the past year, and I haven't really discussed that with them in the sense that I've used that terminology. I don't think I've used the terminology white privilege, but I think I've asked them why this be an issue for this character in the book. Why that not? Why would a well, an example in the novel, the protagonist, his older brother, is kind of a little bit of a delinquent. Nice kid, basically, but he's a little bit of a delinquent. And worried about doing certain things. And I'll ask him, why do you think they're so worried about their son doing this? If he were, and then I say, if he were a white boy, would he be able to get away with that? And they're like, yeah, probably. I said, but he's not. And then I kind of work in the whole Emmett Till story about Emmett Till whistling at the white woman, and what. And I'm gonna have to plug in. But the battery's gonna die. Can you give me a moment?
Sure.
All right, I'm gonna turn the camera off. Oh boy.
We can still hear you.
Yeah, you can hear me.
Yeah.
Oh my.
Go ahead.
I'm just trying to find a place where I can set this down. Slide the table back. Pin myself against the wall. Okay. Okay, this is gonna be one of these old guy taking a selfie images.
Well,
Okay, here we go. All right,
okay.
here's my hand.
There you go.
There we go.
Okay. Okay.
Whoa, big head.
Yeah, I have that problem too. But up, down, center, left, right. So there you go. That's good right
All
there.
right, we'll go with that.
Okay.
So where were we?
You were talking about you know, how you were asking him you know, whether or not if he was white would he be able to get away with it?
Yeah, and I asked, you know, if this were a white boy, would he be able to get away with that? And you know, so then we can actually have some discussion about it, and then later on, when the students are writing compositions, rather than asking, oh yeah, one of your earlier guests was saying about how you only have 4 choices of a right answer. I don't really teach English or composition that way. I'll ask a student what they think about something, and you know, their answer is based on their own thought processes. I grade it more on whether they, you know, thought about the question. You know, is it capitalized, and then does it have periods and punctuation and all that sort of thing. I grade the English more on that, and more on whether they actually thought about what the question was asking. Yeah, I know, like the Watsons Go to Birmingham. At the end of the book, it brings up the 16th Street church bombing in Birmingham, yeah. And in the novel, they think that their little sister or little girl, they think that she was in the church, but spoiler alert, she actually isn't in the church when the church blows up. But I get
I'll have to remember that when I read the book. I'd say, well, Dan gave this away. So go
actually,
ahead.
even with that knowledge, it doesn't wreck the whole thing. But that's the way I bring in a lot of that stuff. And the way I kind of look at it is, I think it's good for them to know about cultures other than their own. And I introduce it the book is so fun. Like the first half of the book is just a lot of fun. It's all like situations that boys can kind of imagine themselves getting into fights, and your older brother picking on you and that sort of thing. And so I think they can relate to that end of it. And then later on, I can just kind of gradually introduce some of these other ideas into it. So I don't really think like teaching about another culture is a bad thing. But I think you're like one of your earlier guests, I think it was Derek. I think he said like it's good if you can find some way to connect it. He said relate to it. I'm going to use the word connect to it. Like, is there a way that I can connect the information?
Can you teach culture without including race?
Good question. I don't know. I suppose like when you talk about like white culture, you could probably talk about English culture and German culture and Italian, and one of your earlier guests mentioned Romeo and Juliet. So that's kind of Italian. So there's like the Italian element in the whole story itself. Plus, it was written by an English gentleman, Shakespeare. So it does kind of give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about English culture. It gives you a little bit of opportunity to talk about Italian culture, gives you a little bit of opportunity to talk about things the way they were in medieval times, but that's all Europe. And one of the things that like I would say my own knowledge base is maybe lacking is like Asian history, African history. I don't know as much about Asian history and African history as I do like European history and European culture. And
I know it used to be, like I said, I'm kind of dating myself, but I mean, there was always, the English teacher always gave you a list of books you could read for extra credit or some extra projects that you could do in order, for you. Sometimes you just need, you didn't necessarily have to need it to make up a grade, but sometimes, if that was your favorite subject or perhaps you were my favorite teacher, then I wanted to do something a little extra. Do you still have reading lists for students, and are they supplied by you or are they supplied by the educational system?
I don't teach reading anymore. I used to years ago, and now they have a reading specialist, and I don't know what she does. I think she does have a book list. I think she picks her own books. When I did teach, like I have students read novels, but I use it more as a vehicle to have them write about things. And I use it more as a vehicle for them to do compositions and to write sentences. The reading teacher that we have, I think she picks the novels. One thing I will say about our school district is I had a very the last at least 10 years or more, probably last 11, 12 years, I've had a very supportive administration that pretty much supported what the teachers did and the novels that we picked. So I have quite a bit of free reign. I'm in a small school, though, a fairly small school district. So I have quite a bit of free reign over what I pick as far as I want students to read. And I think the reading teacher, when she gives out reading lists, like book lists, I think she has quite a bit of free reign also. I think the way the administration kind of looks at it is, as long as there isn't any big problem with it, it's okay. It's probably as soon as some parents start, tearing their hair about it, then maybe they might ask us to reevaluate whether we want to continue to teach that novel. But so far that has not happened with me or anybody else in the school or any other teachers that I know of.
Well, that was kind of my point when I was talking earlier to the gentleman that were here, is that a lot of the blowback is not actually from the students themselves, but from the parents. Mm-hmm. How do you? Well, I guess it's not a problem that you really have to deal with in your particular situation, but you also said that from what I'm hearing, your curriculum is not really that diverse when it comes to talking about other cultures.
It's probably as diverse as I want to make it. And like I said, I try to make it as diverse as I can to a degree where I don't think kids are going to freak out about it. I'm maybe a little bit, what word am I looking for? Discreet about the way I present it. But yeah, I mean, especially with the political climate that we've had, the past 4 years in the area where I live, which is, it was a highly red area, let's say.
Okay.
I kind of have to walk on eggs a bit as to how I present information like that, and I think I do it successfully, and I think I open students' minds to possibilities that they might not have considered otherwise.
As an educator, do you think that this generation is more open to change than past generations that you've taught?
You know, based on my own school district, I don't know. I would say based on what I see across the country, I would say maybe yes. I think, like, I'm in a rural area. I think the rural areas are still not as open to change as maybe like more urban areas. Like, I know if I get anywhere near like Pittsburgh or Philadelphia or Buffalo, New York, or when you get close to the urban areas, it seems like the mindset kind of changes. But once you get out into the more rural areas, it's still, I think, people are kind of fixed in their old ways.
Now, I'm kind of familiar with the area that you're talking about because I moved here from Pittsburgh.
Right. Yeah.
But of course, it was, like inner city Pittsburgh and suburban Pittsburgh. We're probably not as far out as you are. But you do notice the further that you get away from cities, the more conservative people seem to get.
Right.
So, I mean, you have a large Amish population, and some other groups. I believe there's Huguenots there and Huguenots and other cultures that believe in old ways. And then you have, like you said, people that are relatively red. But is a lot of this inherited rather than actually people expanding their horizons? In other words, my grandfather voted red, my father voted red, I have to vote red.
I think that's a big part of it. And I think maybe I know where you're leading with this. You're getting into the whole notion of critical race theory and whether laws and stuff and just the whole cultural system has been set up to be sort of conservative. Is that where you're going with it?
Right, or at least to prepare, or at least to perpetuate it.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think that is exactly the situation. And here's what I run into when I would talk about white privilege. This is the sort of thing I would run into. Like I said, I'm able to kind of get it out there because I'm a white guy talking to these white students and stuff. But if I mention something like white privilege, what I get from a lot of like people in the area is, well, I didn't do any of that sort of thing. Why is that my fault? And and then I usually like come back with, it's nobody saying it's your fault. It's just being aware that the whole reason that the situation is as it is with people of color and people with white privilege is because of the way our laws are set up, the way that sort of like the unspoken rules that certain communities have. So I mean, it's definitely a real thing. It's just like, in order for, I think, rural America to accept the message, it's going to, maybe if we look at them as students. This is just a thought that popped into my head now. If we look at rural America maybe as students, and how can we introduce these ideas and concepts to them in a way that they can relate to first, maybe, and maybe so that they don't feel threatened by the notion. I don't know. It's a thought. I'm not quite sure I'm leading with it. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I know what you're talking about, and I'm going to kind of refer to the picture that you have behind you.
Oh yeah.
The Last Supper, and whether we want to agree with what color or where Jesus or any of that, do you think that in rural America, religion plays much more of a part in the politics of the community rather than the social aspects of the community?
I don't know if it plays more or less. I think it's definitely a factor. It's
Well,
weird.
for instance, if I was in the Hill District in Pittsburgh, my grandmother might have that picture
Right.
in her living room, but my brother would probably have a picture of Tupac.
Okay.
You know, so what I'm saying, what I'm trying to say is, do you think that rural areas are more committed to the doctrine of religion than people that may be more worldly, or at least more exposed to things that rural America might not be?
Yes. Yeah, pretty much everything you said. Yes. I think rural America, you have people that really aren't all that religious sometimes, I think, but
Okay.
they will lock on to this strange, I don't even know what to call it. I don't want to pick on a particular denomination of Christianity, but it almost seems like it's this like Republican Christianity, which doesn't really resemble what I think of as Christianity. But I think it almost seems like rural America, some places that they've created a religion that agrees with their mindset, rather than having like the religion actually affect their behavior and their beliefs. Is that do you follow what I'm saying?
Yes.
Like
Yes.
they've created a Christianity that they like.
Right.
A version of Christianity that tells them that everything you're doing is fine, and you don't need to be guilty or feel bad about anything that's happened, and
Because it's not my fault.
yeah. It's like a religion that they've created almost now, and they still call it Christianity, but I don't really think it is. At least not my definition.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing how we've gotten away from some of the basic principles, and I think part of that is because we let ourselves be lulled to sleep by passing legislation but not enforcing legislation. What are your thoughts on
that? You want to pick maybe a particular one, a piece of legislation, or?
Well, we can talk about voting rights.
Okay.
The voting rights application, and the way it was constructed under Lyndon Johnson, and the way it was actually exercised under Trump.
Well, wow. It's clear that I think that white Republican America is scared that America is not going to look like white Republican America forever, and I think they I mean, the African American vote, people of color vote, Hispanic vote during this past election, I think showed them that, we've had it with that kind of, that old mentality, and so I think that they are afraid that they're going to lose their power. So I think they're playing dirty. I think they're going to try to cheat and rig the system as much as they can possibly rig it to make sure that they can maintain power for as long as they possibly can maintain power. And if that means, making it so that folks can't vote after church or whatever, because they know that's a cultural, thing with African American folks in some communities, they're going to do that. They're going to say, well, we'll make it so they can't vote then. And I mean, it's pretty clear that they've taken polling places out of areas that had like African American communities. They would take polling places out for them to make it more difficult for them to get to a polling place to vote, and have to wait in line for, what is it? Some people waited 7-8 hours to vote, and then he can't get a glass of water.
Yeah, I mean, that's that's one of the things that I'm trying to do is raise the awareness and pass out water at the polling places.
Now, how is that? How is that possibly wrong to like give somebody waiting in line for hours to give them a bottle of water to, you know? That's something I've never had to do in my life. I've never ever had to wait in line at a polling place. I God bless those people that are out there doing it, because I usually go in and I might have like 5, 6, 7 people ahead of me, maybe, but I've never had to wait in a line for hours to get in to vote. So I can't even really imagine the dedication those people have to vote.
Yeah, my polling place is it's just up the hill, less than 5 blocks away, and most of the time, like you said, maybe 3, 4 people at the very most. But even prisoners of war are granted water. So,
right.
But Dan, it was really good talking to you. I enjoyed this little over, however much time it was that we spent together. And I'd like to invite you back. Of course, we're going to be talking about this for the next 4 or 5 weeks. I'll probably get a big panel together at the end, and we'll have another big round table about it. But I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
Why don't you give us your final thoughts? If you have any social media, anything you want people to know about, any blogs or anything that you possibly featured on, give us your final thoughts, and thank you so much for coming tonight.
Oh, I don't have any blogs or any websites or anything like that, but I don't know. I just say, I just wish people would play fair, treat people as people, and it's just because somebody doesn't look like you doesn't mean that they, are your adversary. I just don't understand the mentality. Love each other. Peace and love, as Ringo Starr says it.
Yeah, but I also had a high school football coach that told me a fair is where they judge livestock. So, no such thing as fair. Right. So, as I said, thank you so much for coming. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to having you back.
Always.
Hey, keep supporting me on Facebook, dear Dan. I appreciate the comments.
You bet. Take care now.
Yeah. Everyone, that was our program tonight on critical race theory versus culturally reformed teachings. And I'm glad that we had a great panel tonight. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again next Monday, right here on the Political Consciousness of West Coast Steeler Fan. Check us out on Facebook and also our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe. Have a great night. See you next Monday, where we will be talking about inclusion